Sabancı'da master yaptım, ondan sonra da ders verdim. Şimdi artık... Şimdi şeydeyim, San Diego'dayım. Şu anda şeydeyim, Berlin'deyim, işte tezimi verdim. Yakında inşallah doktor olacağım. Hayırlısı.
Almanya?
Yok, San Diego'da. Almanya'da bitiriyorum.
Bitiriyorsunuz. Şu Almanya biraz uzun sürüyormuş.
Oradakini hiç bilmiyorum. Yani bu şey böyle...
Doktoru bitirip 8 ay sonra falan ancak savunmaya giren...
Yok, ben zaten hani Almanya'da test etmiyorum. Sadece Almanya'daki yani enstitüde bir fellow olduğum için hani bitirme şeyi gibi böyle.
Almanya çok avantajlı bu şeyler ya.
Çok iyi.
Yok, doğru mesaj.
Bir de yani çok böyle bonkörler yani böyle Amerika'yı böyle biraz zengin zannediyordum ama Almanya'da çok daha
yeni bir şey bu yani yeni 3-4-5 yıl değil mi öncesi? Önce o kadar yok.
Evet.
Çok iyi bir yer şimdi ben Almanya'da bu ne üzerineymiş? Yani
Bu bilim tarihi şeyi, Max Planck'ın hani bir sürü şeyi var. Bu bilim tarihi enstitüsü.
var mesela Sociable var.
Evet.
Sizin için en uygun yer mi?
Hı?
Sizin için en uygun yer mi?
Tabii en uygun yer burası, evet. 18 başı, evet.
Evet, tahminim ben heyecanlıyım. Evet, ben de aynen. Ben de kort çalıştığım için filozofu nasıl oluyormuş öğrenelim. Bizim hocalardan birkaç toplantıdan çıktı da yüzden bir hafta bile çıkabilirim.
Tabii canım.
Hepiniz hoş geldiniz Tarihçe konferans serimize. Bugün 10.sunu düzenlediğimiz. Bugünkü konuğumuz Bekir Harun Küçük. Kendisi lisans eğitimini Amerika'daki St. John's College'da tamamladı. Liberal Arts üzerine genel bir programla 2003 yılında. Ardından Türkiye'de Sabancı Üniversitesi'nde 2005 yılında Osmanlı bilim tarih yazımı üzerine master derecesini bitirdi. Ardından University of California, San Diego'da doktora programına başladı. Şu anda savunma tarihi bekliyor konuştuğumuz kadarıyla. Bilim tarihi programında Early Enlightenment in Istanbul başlıklı tezini savunmak için bekliyor. Aynı zamanda Max Planck Enstitüsü'nde bursiyer olarak Berlin'de yaşamakta kendisi. Kendisine tekrar hoş geldin diyoruz ve mikrofonu kendisine bırakıyorum.
Okay, so Esad of Ioannina. I am using this Esad of Ioannina instead of Yanyalı Esad Efendi or Esad el Yanyavi or any other variant because I think this does him more justice than all the other names do. And this is not an unfamiliar figure. and I will get to... Oh, ben şuradan şimdi açayım.
Bir ses.
Tamam, okay. And I'll get to, why I think most of the studies on Esad are empirically wrong. Okay, so what is this talk about? I mean, mainly I will be trying to bring this mid-17th century Latin text to Istanbul in the early 1720s, and it's a more difficult task than I had first imagined. So we are looking at an 18th century Arabic translation of a mid-17th century Latin Aristotelian commentary. And I hope, I'll be able to make this, more interesting than it initially sounds. Okay, so this is what the talk is about. This is sort of the empirical core of my core of this chapter. This is a chapter in my dissertation, but I'll be embellishing it with much additional stuff. First of all, I think I should start out by speaking about natural philosophy. It's a category that's not familiar to most of us unless we are historians of early modern science, and I think I might be the only person in the room who is. Well, just to go about this briefly, it's a kind of theoretical philosophy in the Aristotelian classification. So in the Aristotelian classification, you have three categories. You have practical philosophy that deals with ethics and politics. You have sort of productive or poetic philosophy, which is poetics and rhetoric. It helps you sort of produce words. That's sort of the original intention behind the productive sciences. And you have the theoretical sciences, which comprises of physics, that is natural philosophy, metaphysics, and mathematics. And also in the Aristotelian classification, as well as the classification that follows on the Aristotelian tradition. For example, in the Arabic tradition, in the sort of medieval and early modern European traditions, you find that natural philosophy is a discipline that's superior to astronomy, optics, and medicine. So as such, it's not, a science in and of itself, but it's a sort of means of regulating science. It's a set of core precepts. It's a sort of, as Kuhn would have it, Thomas Kuhn would have it, it's a worldview. I don't know if I agree with that, but I would definitely say that the main sort of goal of natural philosophy is regulating scientific inquiry. And of course, as some of you might be familiar, the meaning and the practice of natural philosophy changes quite radically in the early modern era. I singled out a few works here, but of course, these could be multiplied. One of them is Francis Bacon's Silva Silvarum, which deals mainly with how we can study nature empirically and have principles come out of that empirical inquiry instead of using natural philosophy to impose a set of principles on how we understand nature. Boyle's The Skeptical Chemist deals with, more or less the same issues, and Boyle is also a big proponent of bringing empirical evidence into our inquiry into nature and letting aside all the sort of the philosophical speculation. And Descartes' Discourse on Method is yet a third option where, Descartes argues that, we should rather be focusing on a mathematical investigation of nature rather than a philosophical investigation. And this is early modern and, pre-modern natural philosophy in a nutshell, and I'd be willing to answer questions if you have them later on. And, to sort of focus my inquiry on Esad, I am going to ask these questions. What does this mean? Why is somebody sitting down and translating Aristotle in an era where Aristotle seems clearly outdated? We are looking at, why translate a Latin Aristotelian commentary into Arabic when similar texts already exist as part of Islamic theological manuals? And I think this is one of the key questions that we have to deal with, and this is not a question that I can immediately answer in the scope of this talk, but I think that is sort of the big question for the late 17th and early 18th centuries, what is happening to Islamic philosophical theology. A second question is, why translate into Arabic when every other Ottoman translation in the early 18th century is in Turkish? This also sort of highlights the particularity of this translation, because you have quite a number of naturalistic works, upwards of 20, that have been translated from European languages into Ottoman Turkish. And some of those works are from Greek into Turkish. Some of them are in the so-called, Karamanlıca, the Turkish and Greek letters. So you have quite a bit of a sort of a naturalistic translation movement going on, and this is the only book that's written in Arabic. And thirdly, why translate a text at all rather than writing a philosophical text from scratch? And I think this is also a sort of fairly important aspect of understanding what's really going on here. And as I said, I'm not the first person to look at Esad. There's a monograph on Esad's life and work by Kazım Sarıkavak. There are short articles that Mahmut Kaya has published, İhsan Fazlıoğlu has published, and most recently Sait Özervarlı has published. And they have variously sort of identified Esad as a figure of an Ottoman Renaissance movement, right? There is like a cultural renewal and reform aspect, period of intellectual crisis / renewal, and this is the angle that İhsan Fazlıoğlu has followed, as well as Sait Özervarlı, and the third one is a period for reassessing the Arabic philosophical tradition. Now, I am going to follow a different approach, and I would say mine is going to be a more sort of historicized approach, because all of these things speak of Esad as a very key figure in what's essentially a very long-term movement. So I will look at a lot of other things. I will look at greater visibility of Orthodox Greeks in Istanbul's intellectual landscape, and I will be looking at a new Ottoman culture of erudition that asks people not only to speak Arabic and Persian or, Latin and Greek anymore, but you have to do it all if you are, sort of worth the name. A long-term transformation in Ottoman Empire that associates philosophy with virtue rather than faith. Gentrification of philosophy, that is sort of philosophical pursuits moving up in society. And finally, philosophy's new regulatory role. And I'm going to sort of speak about the very sort of narrow Ottoman context. The weakening of Islamic theology in the 17th and 18th centuries. We already know a little bit about this because of the studies that have so far been done on Mulla Sadra and Ahmet Sirhindi, by far, the two most important sort of thinkers of the late 17th century Islam, of late 17th century Islam. And I was not able to find a single theology book that was written in this period that I'm looking at, which is, I started out with, 1650, 1750. Now my field of expertise is more like 1718 to 1735. I can comfortably say that no theology texts were written in Istanbul in this era. Moreover, I have been able to find a critique of theology in this book, Düretül Yetime fi Tabiyetü Sanaviye, by Muhammed Naci el-Celveti, and I'm sure this sort of Celveti designation means a lot to some of you. It does not mean as much to me, because I would have to sort of pursue a completely different line of inquiry to address why this is a critique of theology, but it's hidden away, and it's Ekmeleddin İhsanoğlu's catalog designates it as a book on alchemy. Süleymaniye's catalog designates it as a book on psychology, whereas it's 75% of the book is actually a critique of Kelam or Islamic theology, and the last 25% of the book is on astrology. And I would also like to highlight the fact that by 1718, nearly all Orthodox Greeks live under Ottoman dominion, and I'll make more of this later on. Okay, origins. So we are looking at a particular kind of Aristotelianism that we broadly call Averroism, and this goes back to the 12th century Islamic thinker Ibn Rushd, and he is, the most distinguishing feature of Averroism is that he designates philosophy as a meta-confessional pursuit. And I want to sort of make an apology for why I'm using this term, because I don't want to use secular or secularism or secularizing. These are clearly loaded terms, but I think as an analytic category that doesn't do much more than it's supposed to do, I think I can use meta-confessional. And by meta-confessional, I mean not bound up with any particular set of religious precepts. Averroes' philosophy is not in itself irreligious, but it's, I would say it's as applicable in the Islamic context as it is in the Jewish context, as it is in the Christian context. And the immediately relevant context for Esad of Ioannina's work is Paduan Averroism / Aristotelianism. And that's mainly because Padua played a very sort of strange role in this sort of the landscape of European universities, in that while most universities were confessional, that is, you either went to a Catholic university or you went to a Calvinist university or you went to a Protestant university, Padua did not really have any such confessional commitments. So if you were a Jewish student, you could still go to the University of Padua, which is quite rare in the European landscape. European context, the context of confessional politics, Mediterranean counter-reformation is clearly one of the very relevant things that are going on, and Catholic, Calvinist, and Lutheran interest in the Orthodox Church are yet another aspect of this, and this has a lot to do with Padua because a lot of the Greeks are living under Venetian dominion, and a lot of these Greeks, at least the wealthier ones among them, are going to the University of Padua to receive an education. And I have read statistics in quite a lot of places. Most people say that in the 17th century alone, the University of Padua had over 1,000 graduates, most of them from the medical faculty. So we are talking about a very sort of Greek phenomenon here. And again, I will bring further meaning to that later on. Now, I want to turn to something that seems quite far-fetched for a talk on Esad, but I think it will sort of prove its usefulness because I want to dramatize the transportation of this 17th century Aristotelian text to Istanbul by looking at an institution, the College of St. Athanasius, established in 1576 in Rome by Gregory XIII, trains Orthodox clergy in the Unit or Greek Rite. It receives 10 to 20 students. It has 8 professors, 1 doorkeeper, and a cook. And it ultimately seeks to convert the Greeks to Catholicism and to undo the Great Schism. So that's the basic function of the College of St. Athanasius. And I want to further focus on this story by looking at 3 schoolmates at the College of St. Athanasius: Leo Allatius, Theophil Corydalus, and Ioannis Cotunius. And you might have noticed that this last fellow is the guy who ends up getting translated into Arabic. Leo Allatius. Leo Allatius is a fairly sort of famous early modern Greek humanist. He is from Chios and matriculates at St. Athanasius in the year 1600 when he is 14 years old. He becomes the Greek scriptor at the Vatican Library, by which we mean he's the keeper of the Greek manuscripts, and later becomes the curator of the Barberini Library. And you might know that Maffeo Barberini becomes Pope Urban VIII, and this is the brothers' library, or like the family library. And he becomes one of the staunchest defenders of the Uniate Church. And he writes 2 books to this effect. He writes many more, but I'm sort of bringing up one because that's the main work that we associate with Allatius, and the second one because it's got a funny title. The first one is about, well, basically, that there was no great schism at all. In this De Ecclesia Occidentalis atque Orientalis Perpetua Consensione Libritres, he makes the case that, the Eastern and Western churches have always been in agreement. And in the second one, he argues against Johann Heinrich Hottinger. It says, Johann Heinrich Hottinger convicted of fraud and manifest imposture. And there he argues against this fellow called Heinrich Hottinger, who's a famous philologist, and Heinrich Hottinger is basically making the case that the precepts of the Greek Church are more similar to those of the Protestant Church than they are to the Catholic Church. Now, this is one of the classmates, and he is clearly a defender of of the unification of the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. Then you have the second one, Theophilos Korydalleus, who becomes by far the most important Greek textbook writer in the 17th century. He is from Athens, matriculates at St. Athanasius in 1605, and then quickly moves on to the University of Padua. As one of the masters of the college said, Theophil Korydalleus is among those who, after living for years at the expense of the Holy See, returns to the East as a confirmed enemy of the papacy. Right, so this is the second type of graduate that you get from St. Athanasius. These people go study at St. Athanasius and end up hating Catholicism. Right, this is one of the natural outcomes. But going back, Theophil Korydalleus then moves on to the arts faculty at the University of Padua in 1609, and he is faced with a completely different environment. Right, at the College of St. Athanasius, he has the Jesuits and all kinds of sort of papal people trying to convert him into Catholicism, and he is resisting, and then he ends up in Padua, and it's a completely different environment. Some of you might have heard of the University of Padua because it's got a very famous medical faculty, and you might have read Hawthorne's Rappaccini's Daughter, which deals with this sort of what an excellent place Padua is for studying medicine. It has one of the very few philosophy chairs in Europe, and that's actually something quite important, because normally at the European universities you have the arts faculty, where courses are taught by basically theologians in training. A philosophy chair means that it's the height of somebody's career. This person who teaches philosophy will not someday become a theologian. It's a sort of a top-level career. It's the symbol of Venice's republican liberty, and this has been sort of very well explained by Boersma and Edward Muir. And this becomes even more so when the papacy opens a Jesuit college in the city. So the University of Padua is using this sort of philosophy chair to basically battle against the Jesuits. So that's what philosophy does in Padua. It is an anti-Jesuit intellectual exercise. And this is the anti-Jesuit Aristotelianism of Padua is what Theophil Korydalleus is exposed to. You have Aristotelian naturalism versus scholasticism, and scholasticism is what you find at the Jesuit college. Aristotelian naturalism is more or less along the lines of saying, look, we agree with Aristotle and we do empirical work according to Aristotelian precepts. So that's what's happening. And it also has a very well-defined scope for philosophy. So the philosophy professor at the University of Padua teaches logic, general, and special physics. And by special physics, I mean, things like philosophical anatomy, so on and so forth. So one of the important representatives, Jacopo Zabarella, makes the case that there are certain parts of philosophy that are accessible to unaided human reason, and that's logic as well as natural philosophy. And he says, when we come to ethics and metaphysics, we have to leave those to the theologians. But as far as physics and logic are concerned, we are free to do what we want as professors of philosophy. And Cesare Cremonini, who succeeds Jacopo Zabarella, reiterates this point and makes it even more militant. And you might have heard about Cesare Cremonini because he is a big opponent of Galileo. He is the person who's famous for not looking through Galileo's telescope, saying, I will never be convinced of, whatever you show me through that looking glass. But that being said, while he's not, quote-unquote, a scientific progressivist, he is very anti-religious. He's radically so, because when he dies, he makes sure that, his grave carries the epithet, all that remains of Cesare, is here. So, he argues that, the soul is not immortal, which is, I guess, the most sort of radical philosophical position that you can take back at that time. But among other things, Cesare Cremonini is by far the best paid academic in Europe. He gets paid more than cardinals do because he is such a figurehead, because he is basically seen as the safeguard of Venetian liberties. He's a sort of like a symbol or a celebrity, like a big-time soccer star or something of the sort, right? So that's Cesare Cremonini, and here we have Padua in the early 17th century, where philosophy is a completely heroic enterprise. And this is what Theophile Corydaleus comes to. So what he does, Theophile Corydaleus, is that he thinks of all the hate he has sort of acquired for Catholicism at the College of Saint Athanasius, and he sees how to fight against Catholicism. So what he does is he translates Cesare Cremonini's works into Greek. And these books later become textbooks in sort of the emerging small academies around what we can call Ottoman Greece, right? You have small academies of the sort set up at Ioannina. You have them at Bucharest, Iasi, and as well as in Moscow. So, but he does sort of the main portion of his work in Istanbul, where he gets a mandate from Kirill, the Orthodox Patriarch, to reform the Patriarchal Academy. So that's the second graduate. Now we come to the third graduate that finally makes it to the Ottoman court. Now, Cotunius is also a graduate of Saint Athanasius. After he's at Saint Athanasius between 1605 and 1613. At 1613, he moves to Padua, and he represents, I would say, the main sort of body of Greek students that matriculate at Padua. He is the kind of person who doesn't want to become either a Catholic priest or a Greek priest, but he wants to sort of make the best of his education in Italy. So he follows a medical profession, initially at least, but he is such a great philologist, or that's what we hear about him from all the sort of accounts of his life. He secures a position as professor of Greek at the Papal University of Bologna in the year 1615. And then he becomes a professor of philosophy, second rank, in Padua in 1632, and in 1637 he is the replacement for Cesare Cremonini. Now, of course, this man has his own milieu, and he's a sort of fairly high-profile man, although, not intellectually, but socially. He's friends with Leo Alatius and Gabriel Naudet and Guy Patin, and these are all sort of the very high-profile erudites of the early 17th century. And he is the proponent of a Greek identity that's neither Orthodox nor Catholic, but rather Hellenistic. And he has this Macedonian connection with Aristotle. I thought maybe this would be visible, but it's probably not. There is his epithet. It says, Veria te genuit, passis quae mille stagiris distat, tune uno mente ab Aristotele, which means Veria has given birth to you, and this guy is from Veria, an Ottoman town. So, but there is clearly a wordplay. Veria also means, truth. It says, truth or Veria has given birth to you, which lies about 1,000 paces from the city of Stagira, which is where Aristotle is born. But you are not even, your mind is not even one pace away from Aristotle's mind. Right, so he's sort of clearly owning this Aristotelian philosophy. And finally, this is the text where he owns Aristotelian philosophy, the clearest commentary on the 8 books of Aristotle's physics, which is the book that gets translated. It mostly focuses on books 1 through 3 of Aristotle's physics. You have the theory of matter, status of natural philosophy, motion for causes and change that are the subjects of this book, and it's by and large a philosophical defense of Aristotelianism against. In the first book, you have a defense against the Paracelsians. In the second book, you have a defense against Pierre Gassendi, who was one of the early atomists of Europe. And then the last one is against the Eleatics and the Neoplatonists and the Pythagoreans, among which we can count Giordano Bruno, Galileo, and Simon Stevan, who is the sort of the mentor of Descartes. So here we have somebody who is defending Aristotelianism against all these new philosophies that are emerging in Europe. And he argues herein that philosophy of nature is an independent and qualitative discipline fully within the grasp of the unaided human intellect, in which he is following his predecessors. He says study of the order of nature imparts justice, fortitude, temperance, prudence, liberality, munificence, and every conceivable virtue to its students. And he also makes the case from very classical examples. He pulls up the example of Socrates. He says, Socrates was willing to drink the hemlock and, kill himself because he wanted to reach the orderly heavens. He says, Zeno of Elea, which is sort of another important classical philosopher. He was also able to sort of withstand torture because he was thinking, how sublime and noble the study of nature is. And he basically, rhetorically presents natural philosophy as a safeguard of Venetian liberties. He does a couple of other things. He says Aristotle is behind Alexander's success, which is, I would say, a typical rhetorical ploy in this period, right? You want to make the case that I, as a royal philosopher, am the sort of source of my patron's success. And finally, he also claimed that Aristotle is the best philosopher of the greatest empire in history, so that means he is the best philosopher ever. Finally, he makes the case that philosophy is a sociable pursuit. Now, this might not seem significant at first, but it actually plays a very key role in assigning a role to philosophy, right? We are thinking in the 17th century that natural philosophy is useful, but we simply don't know why it is useful. And he's saying that philosophy is useful because it's a sociable pursuit. It's the kind of thing that that makes public discourse possible. It's a way of politely conversing with people. It's something that you can discuss without getting into politics and religion and all those contentious issues. And he says only if you do philosophy a certain way do you have a sociable pursuit. If you are a physician and if you are a practitioner of the arcane sciences, by which we mean alchemy and astrology, what you do is not sociable because you are going into a lab, you are going into a observatory, and you are doing solitary work, and you're most likely working in secret. And he says, in addition, natural philosophy contemplates the noble order of nature, whereas the physicians are occupied with baser things and disorder and disease. So it's not good for your mind doing medicine. That's what Cottonius says. And he also says that Aristotle was from the Greek nation. He was from the province of Macedonia, from the city of Stygiris, and he is my countryman and also sort of my conchivis, I guess that would be, he's my hemşerim, Aristotle. That's actually a pretty odd thing to do, and that's what makes Cottonius so unique. He is the man who says Aristotelian philosophy is early modern, Greek philosophy. And you have these ideas such as the nationalization of language and philosophy, which he lifts from Gabriel Naudet's manual on the study of languages and cultures. And then, Esad repeats Cottonius's sort of understanding of Aristotle by giving him this name, Aristotelis bin Nichomachus Estairi el Macedoni. Whereas, most classical Islamic texts will just call him Aristo or Aristotelis. So you have this kind of more sort of nationalized understanding of Aristotle. Now, Cottonius becomes very successful, and I would like to sort of draw your attention to all these things that adorn his name. He is the protector of the Greek nation at the University of Padua. He is a nobleman of Veria, and this was a title given to him by the Comneno family in exile. And he is also a first philosopher of philosophy at the university, first professor of philosophy at the University of Padua. And in the same year he became the protector of Greek students, he also establishes a Greek college called the Cottonian College. It's a very small place that teaches only poor Greek students, and it offers a very intense Greek experience, 8 to 10 students, and there are 3 professors. Everybody has to wear clothing that reflects the particular region they're from. I mean, they have to dine with their professors every evening. Sort of, it's very theatrical. You have to act in a Greek manner, speak Greek, eat Greek dishes probably, observe Greek holidays, that kind of thing. And this becomes, well, a place that teaches lots of poor young Greek students. So this Cotunius is not a purveyor of, a Hellenistic or non-religious understanding of Greekness, not only in words but in action as well. So he becomes the patron of this college later on. Now, Cotunius travels to Istanbul quite well because of, I guess a number of reasons, some of which I won't get into, but I will just make the case that Alexander Mavrocordato, who is a very key figure in Ottoman diplomacy in the early 18th century, is one of Cotunius's last students. And then other things happen as well that bring, all these sort of Greek Padua graduates to Istanbul and basically to many other places in the Western Ottoman Empire, and that's the Ottoman-Venetian War. And towards its end, you see sort of a number of shifts that take place which transform, I would say, the Greek intellectual landscape and, basically commit all Greek intellectuals to a career in the Ottoman Empire. Mavrocordato, 1666, this is, I think, the last siege of Candia, and Mavrocordato is worried that, basically the gates of Italy will close to the Greeks, so he establishes the Patriarchal Library with the help of Leo Alatius. Saint Athanasius no longer admits Ottoman students from 1668 onwards, and again, in the same year, Cottonian College is handed over from the Greek community to the Venetian Senate. So what you have as a sum total of these developments is that if you are an Ottoman Greek, you no longer get to go to Padua as a student. And if you want to go to Padua as a student, you don't have any of these institutions that will give you free education. You have to pay your way through. So you can still go to Padua, but you have to be very wealthy. You have to be able to pay the poll tax at home and pay the University of Padua if you want to do that. So what happens is, you have basically a Greek intellectual environment forming in the Ottoman Empire because, Padua is not an option for a lot of people anymore. And this Paduan Aristotelianism after the 1660s is wholeheartedly adopted by Ottoman intellectuals and physicians. So I would also like to make the case that this is not just a Greek affair, it's the consequence of I would say a primarily Greek phenomenon, but the intellectual phenomenon that results is very much Ottoman. So, something that I would like to sort of modestly bring to your attention is that, Ahmed III is half Cretan, and this is the Sultan that I'm dealing with. His mother is, his mother is from Crete, so is his first personal physician. And then I would like to sort of use these two figures to sort of give you an idea of this Hellenized understanding of the pursuit of medicine. Şemseddin el-Şirvani comes all the way from Shirvan and establishes himself as a doctor in the Ottoman West, and he takes on the epithet el-Itaki, right? He's like, the man from Ithaca. That seems like a fairly strange thing to do, but when you realize that he is interested in philosophical anatomy like they are in Padua, it makes a whole lot more sense. And when you look at Ömer bin Sinan el-İzniki, which is the second personal physician of Ahmed III, he writes a book called Kavanini Etibbai Feylesufan, which means, philosophy, the rules of philosopher physicians, which again is a very sort of Paduan package. Normally philosophers and medical people are separate, and not in Padua. So I'm coming to the final stretch and talking about Esad of Ioannina. He is a very well-known Ottoman erudite. He knows Persian, Arabic, Latin, and Greek. He is probably better than all of those languages than I am. He trains under Şehirlizade Ibrahim Efendi, who is even more of a mystery than Esad of Ioannina. But we know that Şehirlizade Ibrahim Efendi was interested in logic, dialectic, and natural philosophy, though none of his works have yet been studied. Tezkire-i Salim, which is our main source for the life of Esad, among the sort of the customary explanations or the customary accounts that make Esad into a a tiger in a rose garden and a great scholar and so on and so forth, also mentions that Esad frequents the Greek circles. He is friends with Chrysanthos Notara and Alexander Mavrocordato. He teaches Nicholas Mavrocordato and Dimitri Cantemir, and in 1719 he becomes Ahmed III's librarian. And when he is a librarian, he undertakes this translation of Cotunius's physics. Now, nobody who has written about Esad has so far looked at Cotunius's own work. As a consequence, the general claim has been that Esad did not just translate Cotunius, but wrote some stuff on his own as well. That is not true, and I think there is a very good reason why he was interested in translating Cotunius rather than writing something from scratch. So in this one-page preface, you have Aristotelian philosophy is preferred by kings east and west, so that's what Esad is doing. He's saying this is the philosophy of the kings, and the Sassanids adopted this. He says the caliphs in Baghdad adopted this. The Roman emperors adopted this. So everybody, every king loves Aristotelianism. He also makes the case, sort of echoing what he will say in the translation. He says philosophy induces virtue. He also says that philosophy guards against common idolatry or shirk, which I will get to in a moment. And he says philosophy is not about spirits residing in bodies and not about divination, which seems sort of strange to put at the very front unless he is, well, actually targeting something solid, which he is. And this brings me to the sort of the core controversy that I deal with in my translation, legitimate and illegitimate ways to investigate nature. There is a Paracelsian movement in the Ottoman Empire that gains exceptional speed after the year 1700. The main question is who gets to speak about natural philosophy, and you have two factions. One of them are the sort of these Greek-inspired court philosophers that includes Esad Efendi, who says fazilet or virtue is why you do philosophy, and then you have the physicians and the alchemists who say that the only measure of the only reason why anybody has a right to speak about nature is expertise or hazakat. And I would like to sort of bring to your attention a quotation from Nicholas Mavrocordato, who is Esad's student, and I would like to sort of particularly bring you down here. He's saying, the Ottomans are just like just like classical Greece. So they are not, nobody thinks that Ottomans have become modern Greeks, but I think everybody is sort of adopting a very classical sort of self-understanding in this era. And he's saying, however, what holds them back, the Ottoman naturalists, is the shortage of modern works available to them, and their ignorance, that is the Ottomans' ignorance of a solid philosophy that is founded on the senses, which would help consummate their promising nature, which already thrives in a state of natural fecundity similar to that of the ancient Greeks. As it stands, they are consumed in vainly and interminably working through Aristotelian logical tracks, in practicing the alchemical tricks of the Arab charlatans, the result of which is counterfeit money and a condemnation from the qadis, all the while preferring to live in an Epicurean manner hidden under Platonic mysticism, which they openly profess. So I would like to sort of call your attention to that need for a solid philosophy founded on the senses, because that becomes an important part of the court agenda even after Esad of Ioannina. And the problem that unites together this sort of issue of hazakat versus fazilet, shirk, and sort of arcane sciences is the conflation of alchemy and medicine as part of this broad Paracelsian movement in the Ottoman Empire. And by Paracelsian movement, I mean the development of an understanding of medicine that includes chemical recipes. Normally, Ottoman medicine focuses almost entirely on herbal remedies. So what the sort of the scientific content of the Paracelsian movement, as it were, is to bring in both chemical processes and minerals into the sort of the medical profession. And these fellows tend to be radical otherwise as well. The people who practice chemical medicine, they are making up sayings for the prophet, like this one. There are two sciences. One of them is the science of the first is the science of the bodies, and then you have the science of religions. And then you have, well, I guess it doesn't have all the names that I had here, but there are like 6 or 7 names here, and let me see if I can. Yeah. Okay, there you go. Not 6 or 7, I had just 3. So, excuse me. Okay. So you have this sort of dubious saying repeated by radical sort of chemical practitioners and alchemists at several different points, and it's an undercurrent that the court clearly needs to guard against. And here is somebody from that alchemical crowd, Ali Munshi. He attempts a translation of Zekeriya Razi, who's a sort of a radical medieval Islamic thinker, and he says, charges of idolatry have worn down the followers of this scholar. Caution has left the physician without power and made bowls and bowls of sherbet an ample reward for his work. So he is clearly complaining here that his engagement with chemistry, which is what Razi is famous for, has made him, well, a mushrik basically, and he does not like that. Ömer Şifai, another man that I have just mentioned in name, he is one of those people. Actually, he is probably the chief figure who says, look, if you want to do natural philosophy, you need to be an expert in natural things. And he says, when it comes to medicine, it's best to lend an ear only to the hazık physician who has mastered the methods and branches of this science and whose worth is well known. And this much should also be known. Muslim hukema and philosophers of all religions agree that medicine is a branch of natural philosophy, since the subject of natural philosophy is the principles behind all creation. But then he does something even more interesting. And Greek philosophers of our times conspired, ittifak ederler, to subjugate medicine to natural philosophy. Many physicians who subscribe to the new medicine say that while science of medicine appears to be a part of natural philosophy, in reality, natural philosophy is a branch of the science of medicine. So again, you see a clear conflict between these two parties, right? You have the people who associate natural philosophy with virtue, and then you have those people who associate natural philosophy with expertise. And then I'm also going to highlight, what's going on at the Patriarchal Academy, even as Esad is translating these works. Early 1720s, again, not my original research, but sort of information that I have been able to gather from here and there. What you have is the centralization of the Orthodox Church, suppression of the Patriarchate of Muscovy, Jesuits banned from converting the Orthodox, Church of the Holy Sepulchre handed to the Orthodox, Dominicans ousted from Jerusalem, all at Ahmed III's behest. So you see clearly, that the court is trying to protect the Orthodox community from the European Christians or from the Protestants, but especially from the Catholics. And then you also have, and this sort of goes on to argue further that there is such a thing as an Aristotelian orthodoxy in the Ottoman Empire that's defended by the court. This man, Methodios Antrakitis, who used to teach at the Patriarchal Academy, gets ousted from his office and gets excommunicated as well in 1723, right when Esad is preparing his translation. And in turn, he is replaced by Jacob Manas, a student of Mauro Cordato and an Aristotelian philosopher, which again establishes further links between Cotunius and what's going on in Istanbul right in these years, 1720s. And finally, I will leave you with a set of reflections now that, Esad has translated Cotunius into Arabic. Let's sort of turn to why he did that. One question that remains open is whether Esad is a committed Aristotelian or a product of his patronage network. This question, I think, is very difficult to answer because, Esad has written other works, but they are much shorter and more or less, less insignificant than these translations. And we don't really know whether Esad really believed Aristotelian philosophy or whether he was simply a conduit for the court's interest in Aristotelian philosophy. Now, secondly, I would like to raise the question whether, in this era, because there's a clear moral dimension to natural philosophy, I want to ask whether Aristotelian philosophy has become a functional equivalent of Islamic theology, or rather all kinds of theology, both for the Orthodox Greek and for the Muslims living in the Ottoman Empire. Thirdly, I would like to sort of highlight the role of philosophy at the court and therefore the court philosopher, namely the issue of regulating natural inquiry, which is Esad's work, which Esad's works do, and that's what makes him a court philosopher. He regulates the philosophical marketplace. You have seen, the two uses of natural philosophy. You have fazilet versus hazakat, and some of these I have already discussed, but sort of this one final piece of evidence that I would like to sort of bring to your attention, and this last bit is speculative. Esad also translates Cotunnius's logic, and the extant copies of Cotunnius's sort of Arabic translation of Cotunnius's logic say that they were taught at Sahn-ı Seman, and these would date right around the same time from the sort of the first plans for the Sultanic printing press, which never comes to pass because when you have the Sultanic printing press in operation in 1729, it is actually the second attempt at establishing a printing press under Ahmed III's reign. And this first printing press that was attempted but never came to pass originally intended to publish books on philosophy, logic, and astronomy. And this is probably, I am thinking this is what the physics translation was intended for. It was going to be a textbook at Sahn-ı Seman, and it was going to be disseminated through the printing press. And this was going to be the court's means of controlling the community of naturalists through training the ulema in what they thought was right philosophy. And so Sahn-ı Seman becomes the Muslim equivalent of the Patriarchal Academy in a sense. But again, that's speculative, and that is what I'm going to leave you with. Thank you. Yeah, it's not a very large sort of, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry you mentioned this, it was a lot of information. So just, I wasn't quite sure, can you tell us a little bit more about Esad Efendi's own education?
Okay, Esad Efendi's own education. Esad Efendi, as his name implies, is... Oh, I should keep this, okay.
Because we record so that.
Oh, okay.
Thanks so much.
Okay, of course. Well, Esad Efendi is born in Ioannina, which is a major center of Greek education, and Esad Efendi studies under, well, the Müneccimbaşı Mehmet Çelebi. He studies under Şehirlizade İbrahim Efendi, which I discussed. I mean, these are figures that we don't know very much about, so these are just passing names. They don't even have their sort of individual entries in the lists of Ottoman erudites. One thing that we know about Esad Efendi, which, I mean, I'm still considering this sort of new incoming evidence regarding what's happening at the Ottoman court, and that is Esad Efendi is a Naqshbandi. We don't know if he is also a Mujaddidi, but we know that he's a Naqshbandi, which would be in line with his interpretation of philosophy as a conduit for virtue, because that would be, again, a very sort of classic Naqshbandi understanding of, why you do philosophy. But that being said, I mean, we know precious little about, what's going on the Naqshbandi front in the Ottoman Empire in this era. So I guess that's all I mean, and then, he comes to Istanbul, he gets his patronage from Feyzullah Efendi, the Shaykhul Islam, in 1698. that Feyzullah Efendi. I think there are two Feyzullahs. This is the sort of the Feyzullah Efendi that does not get ousted because he is usurping the office of the Grand Vizier. He teaches pretty much in and around Istanbul. He never leaves Istanbul once he comes to Istanbul in the late 1680s, 1690s. And that's all we know about it, really.
Okay, and at what point do you think he would have gotten introduced to Kucuk as well?
He would have been introduced, well, mainly, I mean, he is a Greek speaker. That's something that we don't really discuss, but, you know, lots of people they write in Turkish, but they speak Greek as well. For example, Hezarfen Çelebi, one of the very famous late 17th century Ottoman writers. He is from the island of Kos. I mean, he is a Greek speaker. Esad Efendi is a Greek speaker. And because, I mean, there is no confessional division, right? These people are Muslims. For example, Nuh bin Abdülmennan, right? He is from Venetian Crete. He converts to Islam as an adult. So you have this, well, phenomenon that's really difficult to study because, you know, these people are from Greek-speaking territories. They speak Greek. They probably can read and write in Greek, but they are sort of Ottoman intellectuals, right, who write in Turkish and Arabic. And this, I think, is a fairly common phenomenon that, again, you know, needs to be studied, you know, on its own.
Thank you. My name is Molly Green, and I work on the Greeks under Ottoman rule and on the Counter-Reformation and all of this stuff. And your talk is blowing my mind. So I have many, many questions. I'll just start with two. Why was St. Athanasius closed to Ottoman students in 1668? That's the first question. And then secondly, I mean, I simply didn't know that things happened, such as Esad being the teacher of Nicholas Mavrocordatos.
Right.
I mean, how does this happen? Like, in what context? I mean, in what educational institution, or it's informal tutoring? If you could just tell us more about this education crossing confessional and religious lines.
Right. Well, thank you for both of the questions. In 1668, the St. Athanasius closes the gates, its gates to Ottoman students, and at least, you know, one of the arguments that they present is that, you know, Ottoman students come here and then they stay here for a while and then they go on and become medical doctors, and we don't want to pay for those anymore. I mean, right? We want to pay, you know, we don't want to pay for those people who will become our enemies at all. But we don't want to pay for these either because we know that, you know, they won't go back and serve as Catholic clergy once they are on Ottoman soil. As for Esad teaching,
I'm sorry, do you have any sense of why it happens then?
as I said, you know, just the number of things that happen between 1666 and 1669 makes me think that it has something to do with the siege of Crete. It has to do with, you know, sort of politics writ large. But I mean, I have no way of proving the connection, so it's a loose one. But I think if I pile it, you know, high enough, I think I can make a case. And as for Esad teaching Nicholas Mavrocordato and Dimitri Cantemir, that's I mean, I don't. He is the only example of somebody, a Muslim teaching Greeks. I think there is a possibility that this might have taken place at the Enderun. But other than the fact that he had taught Nicholas Mavrocordato and Dimitri Cantemir, I don't really have, you know, much more to go on. This kind of, you know, tutor-student relationship might not be a widespread phenomenon. But then again, you have, you know, you don't really have anybody as high profile as Esad Efendi in this era. I mean, he is very high profile. He's friends with anybody who is a somebody, right? I mean, he is good friends with the French ambassador. He's good friends with the Patriarch of, you know, Constantinople and the Patriarch of Jerusalem. He's socialized, right? I mean, he's like a noble philosopher of sorts.
Thank you very much. Well, in the literature, we know that there's an important French effect on Ottoman transformation in technology. What about the natural philosophy? Because we know that in that time there's a special relation between the Ottoman and French administrations.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Well, that's actually what comes after Esad Efendi, because pretty much every Aristotelian that I mentioned here is dead or near dead by 1730. So whatever transformation that you get from the sort of the French end of things has actually to do with, number one, with the establishment of the second printing press in 1729, where you have agents of the librarian of the French king, Abbé Bignon, who come and sit down with Mehmet Said Efendi to handpick the books that are going to be published for a European audience. And some of the books, for example, Tarihi Timur and Gülşen-i Hülefa, those are printed for a French or rather a European audience. And what also happens, again, right around 1729, I mean, for one thing, the French and the Ottomans have a very very complicated relationship in this era, because they are sort of butting heads with Louis XV, on the commercial front, right? They want to squeeze as much money out of the French as they can. They want to give them as little business as they can, but they also have this sort of dependency, because the French run basically much of the Mediterranean trade that passes through the Ottoman Empire. So in 1729, when you have the new printing press established, it's an Ottoman-French joint enterprise, and Louis XV pays for most of the paper that's used at the press. And they bring in journeyman Kalfa printers from Marseille to help with the printing press. And you get these sort of snippets of Cartesian texts in Ottoman naturalistic writings, again, in the early 1730s. And I think that's a slightly more difficult phenomenon to understand, because I would say, here, the Aristotelianism is very deep-rooted. I mean, it's got a history going back at least 50 years. Whereas the Cartesianism that comes from the French is a very short-lived phenomenon. I would say, maybe between 1729 and 1735, you have sort of this intellectual French sympathies, and but that's it. I mean, that's really what you get, from the French end.
Okay. I didn't really understand why he wrote in Arabic if that translation was meant for the first printing press.
Right.
Would it make more sense? Would it not make more sense to print it in Turkish then?
Right. I would think, it would make much more sense to print it in Turkish, unless, of course, it was aimed at training ulema. Right. I mean, that's the only, considering everything, that's the only thing that I can come up with. I mean, it has to be targeted at ulema, because there is really nothing else that's translated into Arabic. And I can't conceive that Esad doesn't write in Turkish. But again, that might be more my preconception than no, he probably does write in Turkish, but wrote this in Arabic because it's intended for the printing press. And another thing, that's there's a piece of archival document that Mahmut Kaya brought to light a few years ago, and that shows that there were two Greek sort of assistants or amanuenses that Esad had. And one of those amanuenses that Esad had was the librarian of the Patriarchal Academy. Again, which sort of gives me the impression that you have a really parallel development going on at Sahn Seman on the one hand and at the Patriarchal Academy on the other hand. But again, as I said, this is sort of it's an informed speculation that I'm sort of venturing. So.
Now, about this very strange person, Cotunnius, can you tell me more about this that he said he said or he acted like? What do you mean he wasn't Catholic or Orthodox? He was Hellenistic. He called himself Grekos. What did he call himself in Greek? And this is, can you say more about this? Because this is also
Right.
quite remarkable.
Right. Well, I mean, one thing that that Paggio offers him, right? I mean, he's still friends with Leo Allatius, right? So he clearly doesn't have problems with the Uniate Church. He gets money from Louis XIV, right? But he never, for one, he writes about maybe 18 volumes. He writes nothing about Christianity. He not in any circumstance does he defend Catholicism. So I'm imagining, whatever religion he had in private. And I mean, the Greek college that he establishes, that is a college for Orthodox Greek boys. And it has no agenda to convert. In fact, there is a letter that he receives from Allatius right around the time he's about to establish the college. And Allatius is telling him, look, the Jesuits who have recently taken over the college, after, this is after Urban VIII comes to power, so the sort of the great counter-reformation guy comes to power. So he imposes harsher rules on the Orthodox Greek boys that come to St. Athanasius. So I get the impression that there was a need arising for basically, a school that Orthodox Greek boys could go to without having to convert, and that's what Cotonou does.
But why do you think he is an Orthodox Greek? Maybe just his religious identity for him is unproblematic, so he doesn't write about it. And
Right.
we're struck that you said he's not Orthodox either, and he's a Hellenist. It's like, whoa.
Right. Well, I mean, I think there is a, yeah. I mean, I definitely do see your point. It just seems to me that his emphasis on Greekness and a non-Orthodox Greekness, right? He is saying, look, my hemşeri Aristotle, and he is saying, natural philosophy is about virtue, and he is unlike any other manual writer in his era, in that he doesn't bring any theology into his writings. So I mean, that's what I thought. But I mean, surely you probably know. I mean, your question is more informed than my answer would be. That's the sense I get. Right. Yeah, from he says Macedonia, but he says he's.
Where's Helen coming?
Oh, he says Greek nation. That's the thing that he uses. He says he's from the Greek nation, from the.
What does he use does he use the word Grekos?
Yeah, he uses Greco, Nazione Greco.
He doesn't in Greek say Ellinas.
He does not write anything in Greek. He writes only in Latin. So.
Okay, because to call yourself a Hellene at this point is a fighting word. So
Okay.
So I wouldn't use that word. I would say good.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say
Right.
he calls himself a Greek, he only writes in Latin, and that's a less problematic term.
Okay.
But to say Ellinas at this point is still to say I'm pagan,
Okay. Okay. I see.
that way in English, but that's the sense.
Right. Okay. Now, see, yeah. Sure.
If I may.
Yes, of course.
Besides carrying the microphone, it's a pleasure. This was really wonderful. I mean, well, I'm interested in the court circles, this patronage network. You touched upon at the very, last concluding remarks. Is there any study done, on this network? I mean, a list of people in a more detailed way that Esad,
Right.
Was in touch.
There is, right. Yeah, I mean, there is an article that Salim Aydüz wrote some years ago on I think it was called Lale Devri'nde yapılan ilmi faaliyetler. But that list, remains by and large complete because the people that he looks at are basically, the group of people that were involved in the Turkish translation or whatever you're going to, Turkish rendition of İktel Cüman, which is, it was more like a rewriting of İktel Cüman, and that's a sort of court enclave that you see from his work. But I mean, for me, most of these people were just faces that emerged out of the sort of the shadows one by one, and I can only sort of put together, 3 or 4 people at a time. Like I also know that Mavro Kordato was good friends with Müneccimbaşı Mehmet Çelebi. But I can't give you like a sort of a full range prosopography of what's going on here.
No, I'm not expecting because I try to study networks and it's just an endless exploration. But if you didn't get a chance, what I know from the Topkapı Palace archives.
See, I've never seen what's going on at Topkapı.
Well. Well, first of all, good luck with the access problems. But overall, now we have a new director there, and Sevgi Hanım is more helpful.
Right.
Now, I know this from a colleague of mine who worked on the so-called Lale Devri, Selim from Kara Hasanoğlu. And I know that he had found hundreds of letters from this period, exchange between like Damat Ibrahim Pasha, Ahmet III, and few very prominent members of the court.
Right.
So, considering that this had been a very central figure, both as an intellectual, both as a translator, with all these, people around him, I might just humbly encourage you to go and check
I would love to see
letter collections, which spans from I think from like 1710s all the way to 1730s.
Are these accessible right now?
I believe so. You just probably needed permission from the Kültür Bakanlığı.
Okay. Well, I mean that would be lovely because the last time I attempted to enter Topkapı Palace, I was the bekçi picked up the phone and he said I thought, I called him, I was told that, I was going to get access early this year. He said, you're lucky if you get access in 2015. Yes, no, that's definitely on my agenda, and that's one thing that I want. I also want to look at these alchemists through court records, because I think they would have left, if they are making counterfeit money and killing people with chemical medicines, I would imagine they would make it to the court in some way, That's another sort of empirical piece of work that I want to do after I'm done.
If there's no more question, I would like to thank you again, our speaker. I think I can now say Dr. Harun Küçük because he's already done. Thank you so much.